we travel to. So, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rubik Joshi, and today I will be facilitating a a panel discussion titled "Decommodifying the Narrative: Rethinking Media's Role in Tourism Story." So, today we'll be diving into the more critical and under-examined aspects of tourism ecosystem. We're going to be talking about the role of media in community tourism. For too long, destinations like Nepal has been, has been marketed from a very narrow lens, mostly for their mountains, spirituality, and in some cases, volunteerism destinations. But Nepal, like any other places, are far more complex, it's more dynamic, it's more youthful, and home to more powerful stories that rarely make it to the headlines. So in this session, we're going to be talking about how can we shift away from this single savior-based narrative, and how can media, be it guidebooks, influencers, or travel journalists, become more ethical, inclusive storytellers, and how can we ensure that communities' voices are not just featured, but truly heard and represented as well. So without further ado, I would like to invite our incredible group of panelists who each of them bringing their deep insight from journalism, storytelling, and travel advisory work. So starting off with our first panelist, I'd like to invite Becki on stage. So Becki Enright is an award-winning freelance travel journalist and content creator specializing in adventure and culture travel with a strong emphasis on responsible tourism. She also runs Borders of Adventures, a platform that challenges travel misconceptions through socio-political and and cultural storytelling. Welcome, Becki. Our next panelist is Stephanie. Stephanie Hayes is a seasoned travel advisor and storyteller with over 15 years of experience in the travel industry. Her career has spanned roles in digital marketing, destination branding, and social enterprise leadership. As of now, she's based in Chiang Mai. She's helping travelers plan meaningful journeys and has explored over 60 countries alongside her husband and her young son. And lastly, I would like to introduce our final panelist, Ms. Pooja. Pooja is an independent journalist with a passion for travel, food, and art. She spent over 5 years at National Geographic Travel in India, where she rose to the role of senior sub-editor, and her work has since appeared in publications as BBC Travel, Lonely Planet, and Condé Nast. In addition to that, Pooja also co-manages a family food venture and leads heritage and cultural tours in Mumbai. So, warm welcome to you all on stage. So please note that this session will be for around 40 minutes. And if you guys have any question, feel free to connect with our panelists here during the break time. They'll be around, so it's a good opportunity for all of us to network as well. So without further ado, your mics are there. My first question would be to any one of you. It's an ice-breaking question. So let's start off with what was one travel experience in particular that changed your outlook about tourism? So any one of you can go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone, good morning. Thank you so much for this opportunity, for having me in Nepal and for having me on this panel. To answer that question, it was Sydney for me that changed the way I looked at local tourism, and it wasn't for its pristine beaches or the fantastic food scene, although those were great. For me, it was the local-led tours, which led me to see the city through the lens of its long-time residents. And up until that point, I knew that the Aboriginal people and the Torres Strait Islanders, they were the indigenous people of Australia, but I had no real understanding of their culture, and those tours helped me really connect with the people and their place. And there was so much learning to do. I realized that there are over 300 countries in the indigenous community, and they have nothing to do with the places as we know them in English, or they have 500 languages that differ from community to community. And I still remember something that our guide, Lindsay Williams, he told us that it's not the people that create languages, it's the land that does. And this idea of nature shaping society, where everything in the world has meaning, whether it's plants, birds, animals, they have relevance and they have meaning and place in the world. For instance, something as simple as how blooming of certain flowers would coincide with the whale migration season long before calendars and clocks were a concept, or how they'd crush lemon myrtle leaves and rub onto their skin before the men went out hunting to camouflage the human scent. And then there was this feminist Aboriginal tour, which really, which was an eye-opener for me. And this First Nations woman, she regaled us with tales of the matriarch of the land, and the place is named after her. It's called Barangaroo, and it's a posh business district with jutting skyscrapers, and you have suits milling around with coffee in one hand and phone in another. But in that moment, you're forced to slow down and take a step back and imagine what the place must have looked like as a women's playground centuries ago. And there were stories of resilience, of hardships when the first settlers came to colonize the land. And the fact that it wasn't somewhere remote or obscure in the outskirts, in the outback, but in the heart of the city. And it wasn't just anyone telling the story, but someone from the community sharing their history, their ancestry. It made all the difference. And I've had the privilege of going back to Australia a few times since, and I've realized, I've noticed, how indigenous storytelling is such a vital force in their tourism landscape. And even now, when I think of Sydney, I can't think of the city without thinking of those tours or the people who led those tours from the community. And I think that's why it will always be very, very special to me.
No? Hello? Okay, perfect.
It's working. It's working.
Hi. First of all, I can't believe we have to follow those videos. Those were incredible. And just thank you to Community Homestay Network for the amazing week we had and also the opportunity to be on this panel. I think my first kind of foray into community tourism, I was living in China and I was moving to London to study for my master's in international tourism development. I was so excited to go study how we could use tourism as a force for good. And we were traveling through Mongolia and Russia to make our way there, and I had researched this community homestay kind of company in Mongolia, and I'd spent kind of more money than I usually spend traveling because I was so impressed with it. And I get there, and it sort of turned out that maybe their marketing had outpaced their execution, and it was a pretty flawed project. But later that year, as part of my master's program, I got to travel to West Bengal and work with an NGO called Banglanatak, which promotes sustainable development to promote cultural tourism and sustain these like traditional artisans, and it was done really well, and I got to see what the model could look like. The infrastructure was there, the artisans had ownership, we were there to engage, not just observe, and it was a really lovely experience. And it made me excited for what else was out there. And then I went on to work for G Adventures, and I was really excited to learn about the work with Planetara and the connection there, and just see how much was going on throughout the world.
Great. I agree with the point about the videos, actually. It's something very emotional about watching those and how far homestay concept has come. It wasn't really around or a big concept back when I first traveled and I was backpacking back in 2012, 2013. And so my story's a little bit different and I remember I was in Myanmar, I was just biking around Mandalay, and I found this pink church and I was just standing there and staring at it. And this nun comes out of the church and she's like, oh, hey, come in. And that often goes against your nature of, what you grow up with, don't talk to strangers and that kind of thing. And she invites me in. And we just sit and she makes me fresh lemonade and we sit and talk for 2 hours. And it was a chance to learn about society and politics and how people live in a different way. And it was one of the first turning points where I realized that tourism isn't just about archaeological sites or big places or things that you should tick off your list because it's only about history and heritage. It's also about people. On the flip side of that, I volunteered in Cambodia for a few months, and it was very much led by the Khmer people in terms of who the teachers were and who led the initiatives. But I remember that this charity did depend on tourism money and tourism footfall to keep going, but I was a teaching assistant, and every week or so traveler group would come through, and some of them would sit in the class for 15 minutes, or they were invited to sit in the class for around 15 minutes. And that was my first introduction to how sort of community-based tourism can also be very disruptive, and how we really need to find that sweet spot between being immersive but not being disruptive. And that's something that we're still working on today, and it's something that's very difficult, and there isn't the right answer. But that was my big learning when those sort of two experiences collided.
Thank you so much for your answers. I think one common factor that I think we have in all our answers is the people. It's more about the people when it comes to like experiences that changed your way, how you look into tourism. So focusing, like, let's shift our focus to the next part of the discussion. I'd like to ask this question to Pooja. So I think it's your first time, if I'm not wrong, it's your first time in Nepal. So when you looked up for the information about Nepal on the internet or anywhere, like, you know, what were some of the narratives or images that stood out to you, and how did those narratives kind of help you shape a perception about this destination?
Right. There's always been a buzz about Nepal being a backpacker's paradise and a haven for mountaineering or trekking and hiking. But what stood out to me was this article in the New York Times a couple of years ago, where it said Nepal, particularly I think the region of Ilam, was at the cusp of its organic Himalayan tea revolution. And that's something that I wouldn't typically associate the region with, because when I think of tea in the Indian subcontinent, I think of Darjeeling. And that's precisely what the article highlighted, that it's not Darjeeling tea, it's Nepali tea. And these were small-scale farmers, factory owners who were growing these rare indigenous types of tea at often a fraction of the price of the Darjeeling teas. And it's not the kind of stuff that you'd find at your Starbucks store. It's very boutique, specialty online stores that are then marketed across North America and Europe. But the fact that it still exists, and I had no real knowledge about that, and there is an article that's out there, that was, I think, one of the standouts. And more recently, there was this Netflix documentary that came out called Mountain Queen, The Summits of Lakpa Sherpa. And it captures the Sherpa community, and it follows the journey of Lakpa Sherpa, who is the first Nepali woman to hold the highest record for having summited the Everest. And she did it for a total of 10 times over a decade, and all while raising 2 daughters and surviving an abusive marriage. And I think that documentary, for me, it humanized life in the mountains, and more so what it means to be a woman in a male-dominated field. And these are the kind of stories, of course, there is so much focus on mountaineering, but also these are stories that would go unnoticed in the mainstream discourse, and you wouldn't really know much about them unless you were really looking.
Thank you, Pooja. So speaking of mountains, I think mountains in Nepal is something, it's an inseparable concept, right? So speaking of that, I think my next question is for Becki. I would like to ask you, what's one, since you've already been involved in the community tourism field, right? So what's one travel cliche or stereotype about community tourism that you'd love to see evolve in the media?
Yeah, I think there's still the mindset of dependency, and that communities and local people are totally dependent on an all-encompassing outside savior that needs to come in and change it. And that's not the case, and that's typically mixed with these still sweeping statements about poverty and underdevelopment. So it's all of these negative things that still exist in the media and which still exist in the preconceptions of travelers. And what that often does is creates a mindset in the traveler as well that they're going to come to these kind of places and be enlightened. And it's just a really vicious cycle of negative messaging. And reinforces those cliches when actually, of course, poverty and underdevelopment exist in particular areas or particular countries, but it's so much more nuanced than that, and it's not the same everywhere.
Thank you, Becki. So moving on to Stephanie. Now that you know, as per your experience, how do you see community tourism being presented or requested by your clients at the moment? Is it something that they're actively seeking?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I enjoyed the last session about mainstreaming it and hearing from the partners that are working on mainstreaming it, because I think part of my job, and I'm relatively new to the travel agent world, but is speaking directly with the customers. And I think, yes, you have some travelers who have some sense of what they want. Maybe they read about an initiative or they're super passionate about sustainable tourism. But most people don't ask for it by name. They're not like, I want to do community tourism, the vast majority, right? So they don't really speak the same language maybe we're speaking in this room. But I don't know that they need to, because what they do come and say is, I want an authentic experience. I want to go off the beaten track. I want to connect with locals. I want stories, not photos, however cliche it is. And then it's my job and our job to kind of hear what they mean, not just what they're saying, and frame it in a way that kind of resonates with their interest. So instead of buzzwords and jargon, you might say, hey, there's this really cool weaving community outside of town, and you're going to go see the process, and then you're going to sit down with the locals and have tea. And all of a sudden, maybe that resonates, and they understand that, and they go there, and they learn that it's authentic and it's memorable, and a really meaningful way to travel, and just kind of meeting them where they are a bit, and teaching them about this wonderful world of community tourism.
Thank you, Stephanie, for the answer. So moving forward, let's talk about some unexplored stories now, right? So my question back to you, Stephanie. So there's this thing. I think it's a new concept that I've heard recently. So there's this shift in the travel behavior, right? There's been a noticeable shift in the travel behavior. So, such as like, so what, as per your experience, what does that shift? Like, what do you see? How do you see that shift? Like, I'm talking about, such as like a growing interest in slow travel, slow tourism.
Sure, yeah, and I think it's a little bit related to the last thing, and it's pretty nuanced. But they definitely want to slow down. I feel like less people now want to go see 5 cities in 10 days and that sort of thing. But on the flip side, I work with a lot of American clients. They have limited time off, and they want to make the most of their holiday, and sometimes that translates into seeing top sites. But I do think people are asking better questions, is what I'm noticing. Like, where does the money go? How does the community benefit? Am I leaving this place better than I found it? Those kind of things. So they're open to doing things differently, but they don't want to miss out, and they need a little help figuring out how to do that. And so it's interesting hearing from all of you, because I think I often work with clients that they're really starting from ground zero. Like, some tourists have never engaged with the local period in their travel. They've gone to a museum, they've seen the sites, they might not have done that. So, for example, I have a friend in Hoi An, Vietnam, a wonderful young woman. And Hoi An is, over-touristed, it's on every route. But she's just outside the city a little bit doing a cooking class. It's not revolutionary, but she's a local, and it might be people's first time going outside and doing something ever so slightly off the beaten track. In the same regard, in Chiang Mai, I use a motorbike food tour company, which, again, very typical tourism experience, but the drivers are local hospitality students who want to practice their English. So I think, we're all very embedded in this work and passionate, but you have to remember that clients are starting from the zero, and so I consider it my job to sort of pique their interest and hope that on the next trip they do something a little bit more adventurous, the next trip they do something a little bit more adventurous, and then they end up in Dankuta one day.
Okay. Moving on to Pooja, I think you, now that you were able to experience Nepal more intimately through the trip, right? Like what changed in that perception that you had about Nepal before arriving and after arriving here?
That there is more to Nepal than the mountains. By all means, you have tourists coming into the country for specifically that, for trekking and hiking. And I'm not saying don't do it, but whether or not you choose to go down that road, there are alternative, more meaningful ways to also experience the region. And that's exactly what community living showed us. And Becki and I, we were both in Nha Trang and Hemjakot. And they're both along the Annapurna belt, which straddles or grapples with the troubles of over-tourism. But connecting, living with the communities and their homestays, it didn't just allow us a chance to, I think, meet the residents, but also connect with them, understand their culture a little better, live their lives or experience daily life and what it means to live in a region like that. And yeah, there was this one instance, I think, in the first homestay where Saja was translating most of the conversations for Becki and I. And she mentioned how the woman in the first homestay, Sita, she would initially, when they just started running it, she would hide behind Saja and let her take the lead and explain how the whole operation runs. And that's changed because now she is the face of the homestay. She comes forward and there's that, you see that confidence that it has given them. And like someone pointed out in the reflective session yesterday, that we often think of how travel is going to affect us, but we forget that it could also affect the communities involved. And seeing that real change happen in front of our eyes, I think that was one of those standout moments to see. And these are, again, narratives that go unmentioned in the mainstream discourse, but they often add so much value and insight. And I think it's very vital in how we tell the story of a place.
Thank you. That was a very insightful answer. So moving on to Becki, I think you mentioned earlier as well, you know, the cliched narrative that is used in community tourism. So it is true that destinations that promote community tourism are often mischaracterized as places in need of saving. I think that is something that I kind of noticed while working in this sector as well. So, you know, how can we shift away from this mindset, and how can media play a role in promoting a more balanced and empowering representation of a certain destination?
Yeah, I think we need to change who the narrative is serving and tell these stories of lived experiences rather than reinforcing the cliches that exist. Like, we don't need more BuzzFeed style, you know, 16 things about Nepal, but number 6 will surprise you. Like, we just need to move away from those and listicles. And as writers, we need to push those elements of cultural nuance and innovation and initiative and generations who are wanting to come back to Nepal because they have new business ideas. And we also need to give greater context and explanation around all of these things. But we're also targeting a very specific traveler when it comes to this kind of tourism. And so you're always going to have the people that instinctively travel like this. You're going to have people that simply don't care, and that's fine because they're not the people you need to be targeting. But you've got those people in the middle, a bit like what Steph brought up, who are unsure about how to go about it, want to do it, have heard about it, don't know what a homestay looks like, how it operates, how to get there. And they're the people that we need to capture in those stories. However, it's such a niche offering at the moment because we're talking about making it mainstream, and one day it will become that, and that's what we're all working towards. But because it's so niche, we're finding that editors are saying to us, well, you know, this isn't the kind of story that's going to get us tons of clicks because we exist in a media space that's based on, you know, sensationalizing things or, you know, negativity. It's things that are going to get the eyeballs, and sometimes editors are pushing back and saying, well, there's not going to be that many people that are going to read that. And there might not be as many people. You might get a third of the views on this kind of story. But those views are going to be to the people that really want to do it. And so media plays a role, but media needs to adapt and sort of give it a chance.
Thank you, Becki. Following up on Becki's answer, I think, you know, it's kind of, community tourism is kind of a growing niche at the moment, right? So, you know, my next question is for Stephanie. You know, as someone who influences travel decisions, how do you, you know, kind of balance promoting these authentic experience and managing expectations shaped by the mainstream media at the same time? So,
yeah, I think it's really tricky, and I think like you come into every situation just naturally with an expectation, whether that's from the media, your friends, or your family, and sometimes that's really helpful, and sometimes it flattens kind of the destination you're visiting. A few years ago, I ran a social tour operator in Mumbai, and we gave small group responsible visits to an underserved community with the goal of changing the perception that there was a very clear one out there. And it was an uphill battle. We were like constantly trying to just get people to come. And once people came, 9 times out of 10, even more, their perspective totally shifted, and they understood, wow, this is a lot more than what I thought, but the battle is getting people there. So I think to Becki's point of like, your niche people that are already, and then the people that are never going to care, and finding that sweet spot in the middle. And I don't necessarily see it as my job to totally manage all of their expectations and dispel the narrative myself. My job is to vet these experiences and guide them there and hold their hand and say, you should go do this, and then let people like Community Homestay Network, the work speaks for itself. So we just have to get them there and get them interested.
Thank you, Stephanie. So, for my next question is for Pooja. What are some ways journalists and storytellers, who are obviously from outside the community, can meaningfully support locals in shaping how their stories are told?
Hello? Yeah, that's a very powerful question, especially in the context of rethinking extractive storytelling. I think as journalists and storytellers, we have a real responsibility to move away from extractive practices and focus on how to support the local communities. And I think that begins with humility. Instead of treating them as subjects to be observed and woven into narratives, take a step back and listen. What is the story that matters the most to them, and what is it that they want to highlight? And instead of coming in with a preconceived notion and your own biases about, oh, this is what I think of the place and the community, and that's, I want to mold it to fit that narrative, I think let them take the lead on this, and it's more important for you to then become collaborators with the locals and think of them as equal stakeholders with valuable insight and perspective and agencies. And even when it comes to giving them credit, we shouldn't be holding back, whether it's your article, a podcast, or a video. Give them credit where it's due. Quoting your local tour guide or your language translator or cultural interpreter, and name-checking the names of their businesses, because they're often very small. It could be a mom-and-pop restaurant, a family-run homestay, or a local tour company. But the fact that you give them that space on your platform, and there is a real chance for this to then turn into a tourism opportunity. There can be tangible growth here. And yeah, being transparent, I think, is another thing that I wanted to bring up about letting them know what your intentions are with the storytelling. Being honest and upfront with them, and letting them know who your audiences are, which part of the world their stories are going to reach. And when you have the final product, sharing it with them in a way and in a language that's accessible to them, it creates this sense of trust and accountability, and I think it's very important going forward. And I think eventually it boils down to your ongoing commitment to self-awareness, checking in your own biases, your privilege, your position as an outsider, and ensuring that the storytelling process is not the one that overshadows, but instead empowers the community being represented.
Thank you, Pooja. Back to you, Becki. So, how do we balance those stories that kind of show need or resilience without reducing any sort of destination to a place that needs saving?
Yeah, I think I'm just building on some of the points that Pooja made. One way is we can shift the language that we use, telling stories and moving away from describing somewhere as a place that's lacking to a place that's evolving. And another thing which I think pertains more to social media especially, I always say that should be a sense of place over a sense of self. It's not about how you look in the picture. It's not about how you feel in a sense that you're describing how you feel to get attention. It's not about doing something that makes you feel good and look good. That's my bottom line when it comes to how things are presented on social media. We should be showing grassroots initiatives, how communities are rebuilding after a disaster, how the younger generations are doing different things. And at the end of it, the traveler is just the observer. They are there to experience, to immerse, to participate. They are not there to fix a destination.
Thank you, Becki. We're almost approaching the end of our discussion now. So, now let's focus more towards solutions. And so I'd like to start off with Stephanie here. So, as travel advisors, what role should travel advisors be playing in terms of educating clients about products and experience framed around giving back?
Yeah, sure. I think, and a little bit related to the last question, but I kind of act as like an interpreter, right? It's like take the values from the experience, whether that's fair wages or cultural preservation, community empowerment, and reframe it in a way that's exciting and not preachy. I think sometimes we say giving back and it sounds like you're asking somebody to make a sacrifice or that it's charity or there's this innate like hierarchy. So instead just framing it as a richer way to travel. I think, I haven't done the Momo experience, but I think that's like a great example of go here and you get to spend time and cook a food that's local to this area and connect with people. And it's not this, I don't know, just not framing it as this kind of giving back thing that I think we see a lot, and showing people that it directly supports livelihoods. Because then I think people will realize that it's not an alternative. This is the most meaningful, memorable way to travel. It shouldn't be like, oh, we could do it this way, we could do it this way. Like, this way is memorable and it's standalone and it's not a compromise.
Thank you, Stephanie. Moving on to Pooja. In your opinion, what untold or underrepresented aspects of any destination do you think should be central to any country's tourism narrative, in your opinion?
I was speaking with an environmentalist recently, and he said something that really stuck with me. And he said there can be no conservation without commercialization. And not advocating for commodification, because that has undercurrents of exploitation, and I'll get to that in a minute. But to give you some context, this guy, he runs a 4-tented safari lodge in Javai, in Rajasthan, in India, and it's spread across 100 acres of land. And he is very upfront about the kind of tourist that he wants. It's, if you are seeking loud music and you want to party over the weekend, have your barbecue, you're not welcome here. This is not the place for you. But instead, if you want the peace and quiet, you want to connect with nature, you have respect for wildlife, this is the place for you. Now, because this place is becoming a wildlife hotspot for its thriving leopard population, tourism is really picking up. And with that, a number of hotels are also springing up in the region like wild grass. With this comes the real threat of over-tourism. Now, what they've done in the region is shutting down tourism is not the solution, because that'll upend lives and it'll really affect the people whose livelihood depends on it. Instead, the local panchayat, they've been working towards capping the number of NOCs being granted to hotels and restricting the number of vehicles allowed into certain safari zone. Instead, redirecting traffic to places that are less crowded. This is a small and simple step towards responsible tourism, but in the larger picture, it plays a huge role. And when commercialization is done meaningfully, I think we can all agree that it can be rewarding. Yeah, it creates job opportunities. There is income coming in. There's also a chance for these rural and marginalized communities to gain directly from tourism. If you were to shut it down entirely, it would devastate lives that depend on it. And of course, this cannot be the sole responsibility of the locals or the private sectors. I think it is important for the government to also get involved. There have to be policies and laws in works. And the private sectors and locals can then operate within that framework, so there is very less chance or minimal chance for exploitation to take root. And yeah, we often talk about the perils of over-tourism, but I think under-tourism can be just as devastating. So instead of shutting something down or crowding to already saturated areas, it's important to create alternative experiences in places that are not as crowded or that could do with more tourists in those regions. And yeah, that's where I think community-led initiatives also come into play, and it's more about helping sustain livelihoods of the locals as well.
Thank you, Pooja. Okay, so moving on to Becki, I'd like to ask you, how do you see the future of travel storytelling evolving to becoming more inclusive and community-led?
Again, I don't want to repeat too much of what Pooja expertly said, but it's about collaborative storytelling and with the people that live in the places that we're visiting, and that we're simply guests in that person's narrative space. And as media, we are like the funnel or the platform to share those stories. And so we really have to make sure that we get as many quotes and perspectives and as much information as possible. And with this, ethics and consent are non-negotiables. Get informed permission, understand the context of the conversation you're having, and if you don't quite understand it, find out. Pooja and I were discussing at our homestay, actually. We looked at each other and said, oh, do you know what story you're going to write? And we both agreed that we had gone into this homestay experience without any preconceived or ideal story that we wanted to write. And sometimes when you do cover a story, you kind of know which angle you want to take, and you think to yourself, well, I really hope this person says this to back up the point that I would like to make. And in this case, it was interesting that we both had the same perspective, that we really tried to pull back on biases or an idle story, and went in with a really blank sheet, and that we want to go home and spend a few days just thinking about it all and then thinking about what the story would be.
Thank you, Becki. So we're almost in the last part, not almost, we're actually in the last part of the discussion now. So Mike, this last question is addressed to all of you. Like before, any one of you can volunteer to answer this question first. So my question is, if you could leave the audience with one idea to reflect on when it comes to tourism storytelling and community impact, what would it be? Any one of you can go ahead first.
Who's good? I don't know. I'm just banging the same drum, but this is who I am. We should always decenter ourselves. The traveler is not the hero of the narrative, and our name might be on the piece that we write or the social media post that we put out, but if the local voice is louder, then we've done our job right.
Thank you. I think everyone agrees with that as well.
Thanks.
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, my storytelling it's different. It's direct to clients, and it's how are we conveying these places that they go. And I think a lot of, like I've said, a lot of my clients maybe aren't like, it's not that they're not totally ready for this. They need my help in explaining how to be responsible, and community homestay networks help. But I'll just, like, personally, if you're one of my tour mates, you've heard this. When I travel, I prioritize cities and trains and food. And so I hadn't been to Nepal because I don't hike or whatever. But I also love getting to understand local communities. So this really piqued my interest. And so I think finding those things that resonate and that pique people's interest, maybe if they're not perhaps, the totally perfect person you expected, there's a lot to be said for these experiences. So I don't know, I tried to figure out how to not be cliche about it, but having an open mind towards this kind of thing to understand that maybe it's not what you think and you'd like to do more of it, and this is a priority for you when you travel. I think that's kind of my job, my takeaway, to convey that to people.
Thank you, Stephanie.
I think for me it's really important that we all ask ourselves whose voice is telling the story and why, and who gets to benefit from it. Because tourism storytelling, travel storytelling, it's a very powerful tool. We can shape perceptions and get people from the outside to see the communities in a certain way, drive economies, and also shape how the communities see themselves. With great power comes great responsibility. But yeah, if the stories are only ever being told about the communities and not with them and by them, we risk reinforcing the same stereotypes, silences, and hierarchies that we're working towards dismantling in tourism. And I think it starts by taking a step back, creating space for local voices, and sharing the platform. And I think that's where transformative, reflective, and more respectful storytelling begins.
Thank you, Pooja. Well, thank you all for your time. And, we had a very fruitful and efficient discussion, I'd say, because we're still ahead of schedule. I think from this discussion, my key takeaway has been, as stakeholders of responsible tourism, I think each stakeholder has their own role to play, and there's like I think from the previous session, we kind of realized how important collaboration is when it comes to promoting a destination responsibly. And I think at the same time, as storytellers, we also are we also have an equal responsibility to generate a narrative about a destination without actually creating a threat to that destination. So with that being said, I think I would like to thank you all, and I would like you all to please remain seated, because we have a token to be distributed to you. So with that, I think I'd like to conclude our session for today. Thank you all so much for your time. I hope you had a very insightful session.